Hey, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Eapen. I'll let him introduce himself here in a second, but before we get started, please like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think about what we're doing. If you dislike, go ahead and subscribe, and you can hate watch me, and you can send the same comments you have been sending, both through YouTube and in my DMs on social media. I like reading them. They're great. I'm not sure where I stand politically now based on your comments, but with that, Eapen, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'm a long-term, advocate, lobbyist, activist for drug policy and criminal justice reform. Over the last decade, I've worked extensively on civil asset forfeiture, marijuana legalization. Now I think society is ready for a larger conversation about drug decriminalization and legalization of other drugs after marijuana. So, certainly had a very interesting and very interesting career. And, I think we're beginning to see a lot of things kind of change, systemically in America's criminal justice system. So, I definitely appreciated you when you were in the lieutenant governor's office when we met several years ago, and
Yes.
we came to talk to you about medical marijuana policy. And I was always surprised by how receptive Jefferson City was to the idea, and I'm glad that we were able to create a greater degree of awareness in some of these issues.
Oh no, I agree. And like you said, I was working in the lieutenant governor's office when we met, when you were lobbying for the legalization of medical marijuana, and you had a great emphasis on the ability of veterans to access it. And I'm a veteran, and the one you're talking to, I mean, we can go through. I went through Prozac and Effexor and Klonopin, and I can keep going on a list of stuff they had me on at various times.
Yeah.
And well, now I'm on vitamins and some sinus medicine, but that's it. At the time, though, I think there would have been value in me had it been available and legal for me to partake in it. I think it would have helped.
Yeah, there's no question. I think one of the big issues that we've had, especially with medical marijuana, is that over 40 years, we have had very minimal clinical collection of data and clinical trials, right? I think there's only been one trial that the FDA has approved in over the last generation or so for medical marijuana, and or at least for the whole plant botanical marijuana, as opposed to any kind of processed or extracted product. And that was actually a clinical trial on whole plant smoked cannabis as a therapeutic for intractable PTSD in Air Force veterans.
Yes.
That was done by Dr. Sue Sisley out of the Scottsdale Research Institute in Arizona.
Yeah, and you actually got her to come down and talk to us about it.
Yeah, it was crazy. We had absolutely no support from, there was 3 different ballot initiative campaigns that were raising and spending millions of dollars. And we had absolutely no support on bringing in America's leading clinical researcher on marijuana to Jefferson City, because they didn't want us to get anything out of the legislature. And we actually had a physician, Representative Dr. Jim Neely from Cameron, Missouri, who had created Missouri's Right to Try statute, which allows you to access through a regulated framework, unapproved FDA drugs.
Yes, I think there was a federal. I think Trump actually pushed through a federal law.
Yeah, so we had a proposal in 2017 and 18 sponsored by Dr. Neely, where we would have expanded Missouri's Right to Try law to include marijuana, to include Schedule I drugs. And then in 2018, Trump, signed off on the federal version of the first step. So
yes.
There's now a federal analog to Missouri state law that allows for a federally regulated process outside of FDA jurisdiction to access and use drugs that have passed the stage 1 of a clinical trial but have not been fully approved. And that's really been a tremendous step, because the criticism of the FDA is they're just really timid and don't. It takes forever, and it's extremely expensive. It costs like $1 billion to bring an investigational drug to market, right? And
Yeah.
the process can be 5 years to a decade very easily, right? And especially with Schedule One drugs like marijuana, you've got plenty of good data, or at least you've got data, but it's not from clinical trial collection, at least not in this country. The Israelis have done a tremendous job of clinical trials and clinical data collection. But we
Yeah,
don't.
and you actually turned me on to a lot of those studies, and I mean, the Israeli Defense Force actually allowed active duty soldiers to participate in trials for PTSD after the last war in Lebanon.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Israelis have. They're one of her most important allies in the Middle East, and it was Israeli scientists who actually identified and extracted, I think, a lot of the cannabinoids that we now realize have
Yes.
a ton of medical value, right? And so they were definitely the pioneers. It was, I think, over $1 billion, maybe $2 billion worth of investment into, clinical trials and medical development in Tel Aviv this year. And we're hoping that some of those resources come to the United States. I've been kind of looking and working with a group called Neom Medic, which is this is an Israeli company out of Tel Aviv that has 12 years of data collection from the Israeli medical marijuana program. So they have an extraordinarily broad and deep data set that allows them
Yes.
to make dosing recommendations and product recommendations for numerous conditions, accounting for comorbidities and polypharmacy, which is that data is gold once you have a company that has is looking to put an investigational drug application in front of the FDA, because now there's data to substantiate a lot of clinical uses for this. Companies like this Israeli company have it.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the comorbidity, because I know going through VA is generally, if you're diagnosed with PTSD, you're also diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, generalized depression disorder, or they make it more specific, but generally you're diagnosed with 2 or 3 things along with the PTSD. And I know the meeting we had with Dr. Sisley, you were able to hand off a thumb drive to me with, it was over a gig of different research reports that other countries had already done research on the effects of marijuana when used in PTSD trials. And they all showed great success.
Yep. So, hopefully, we're not too far away from a federal policy change on this. Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, has pledged to put a bill on the Senate floor soon. The House has passed, in the last year, has passed a comprehensive marijuana reform policy. And hopefully we'll see, something negotiated between the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, this year. I think what's really interesting is that the Biden administration has done a lot, I think, that's not really getting a lot of recognition right now. But, from the Department of Justice and federal regulatory perspective, we now have an attorney general who is openly talking about why he doesn't think that going after marijuana use is a good use of federal resources. The new Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, who was confirmed recently, is a big advocate for marijuana legalization and decriminalization. You have a Health and Human Services Secretary Becerra from California, who has been an advocate for marijuana, medical marijuana as well. And you have the new DEA nominee, Ann Milgram, who is the former Attorney General from New Jersey. She was actually supportive of the implementation of the New Jersey medical marijuana program in 2009, right? So what I think this kind of all adds up to is I think we're going to see one of two things, maybe both, who knows. But it looks like from the executive standpoint, the Biden administration is beginning to posture in terms of a rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule 1 maybe to Schedule 2 or 3. Who knows? Now, of course, I think the big debate in Congress is, should we move it down a schedule and do it that way, or should we deschedule it like we have done for tobacco and alcohol? So I think I think the window has shifted significantly. In other words, right? I think the most significant debate we're having on this again is, should we deschedule it or should we reschedule it, and how should that change happen? Should it happen through legislation or should it happen through executive action? So.
Well, I can give you the opinion I have, and that's based on other videos. People who watch my videos know I think it should happen through legislative action, because I think Congress needs to actually accomplish some things. Yeah. But let me go back to it, because I don't think I've ever actually expressed this opinion. I've been confronted about it, and I finally gave my opinion. I am a libertarian leaning independent, but I do support full legalization of recreational marijuana. And as somebody who's traveled to Colorado and in Denver, I actually talked to a few people that worked in a dispensary there. Their whole argument with legalization was not that it was legalized. It was done so rapidly. There really wasn't a lot of thought process for the taxes and everything else to go with it. So I would like to see it legalized, regulated, and have kids and adults educated on it, just like we do with alcohol now or tobacco now. Let's treat it the same way as we treat alcohol. Because I mean, that's, in all honesty, I would almost, okay, you want to ban something? We'll ban alcohol and legalize marijuana. It has far less, in my life experience in almost 49 years, marijuana has far less physical and emotional and evil ramifications. I've seen people do far worse things on alcohol than I have on marijuana in my life. I'll just leave it at that. I think it should be legalized and regulated.
Yeah, you ask any cop, would you rather deal with someone who's drunk or someone who's stoned? It's no contest.
Unless he gets between me and my Cheetos.
Yeah,
but yeah, I am for full legalization, because I think we're at a point now. We just need to accept, because if you want to go back and you watch all these specials, and there's quite a few of them, the History Channel did one. Basically, the first laws against marijuana came about and dealt with Mexican immigrants bringing it across.
Mm-hmm. And then you had in the 20s and 30s, there was, jazz musicians, mostly black and Mexican immigrants. And then in the 60s and 70s, under Nixon, there was, Nixon hated Jews and he hated hippies.
Yes.
Right? So he looked at drug prohibition as a way to deal with the hippie problem, right? And it was definitely an instrument of a culture war from an earlier generation.
Yes.
And, what's fascinating is the University of Missouri Historical Society, which is, I think, is it still on the Mizzou campus? I think they moved it to a new building or to a new facility in the last couple of years. But they have a collection from a San Franciscan folk ethno-linguist named Peter Tammany, right?
I did not know that. That's something I want to go check out now.
Yeah, so this guy he kind of collected media, newspaper clippings, posters, signs, magazines, all kinds of media, print media, over with covering a lot of vernacular, words and ideas that were kind of part of our American English history. Right. So at the Historical Society, they have like probably a tractor trailer full of boxes of like media specific to specific words and phrases that were common in the last 100 or so years. And the collection, I think itself, is primarily composed of media between 1910 and 1984 or 85 when he died.
Yeah.
But if you pull the box on marijuana and hemp, right, there's like 3 boxes of like media, right? So like it's really extraordinary to see the rhetoric of 1910 and 1920 and 1930 and how it develops through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, right?
Yes.
And I documented a lot of these a lot of this media. It's a fascinating history. So like I'm here in Kansas City right now, and there's part of that collection. There's union cards from jazz musicians in the 20s and 30s where they're sanctioned for getting arrested for marijuana by the union. There's articles from local newspapers. There's a publication here in Kansas City called the Westport Trucker, right? Kind of a countercultural,
I'm actually familiar with it.
Right. And I found this op-ed in the Westport Trucker in like 1972, right? So in 72 or so, there was a big crackdown on marijuana in Kansas City, and police came in, arrested all the pot dealers and growers in Westport, which was kind of a historic center of drug culture. And there's this op-ed in this newspaper, the Westport Trucker, talking about how after they removed all the potheads in Westport, the heroin dealers came in, right? And talked about this shift from marijuana usage to opiate usage. And it was like you could take the dates and place names and names of certain people out, from the 1970s and replace them with current day names and dates, and it would be very relevant today, right?
Yeah.
Think about it, you have opiate epidemic kind of on a generational track. You had opiate epidemic in the 30s, you had it in the late 60s, early 70s, you had it, in the, last decade, right? And especially in terms of pain management and medication, for that has wide applicability to a number of conditions that involve chronic or acute pain, right? The use of marijuana as an analgesic is typically considered very safe, right? But yes, you take these options away from people, and they go to much more dangerous drugs, which, I think I think the opiate epidemic of the last decade has had a lot to do with how we think about drug policy, right? Because number one, it has really given us America a perspective on what dangerous drugs are, right? Marijuana, maybe you don't like the smell, maybe you don't like the effect, but you can't argue that it's non-toxic and it has pretty minimal side effects, with some minor exceptions in some, specific individuals. So it's a relatively very safe drug, No,
I would agree with that 100% based on what a friend told me.
Right.
No, you know where I'm going with this. It's like I said, I would rather deal with, and you brought it up with police. Based on my experience, and I'll own my experience, you said police said, I will say based on experience, and this is as somebody who still actually imbibes occasionally, but the difference that I've seen, especially from the standpoint of 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old alpha males in the military, I've seen far worse repercussions from alcohol than I ever have from marijuana.
Yep. And to kind of go back to that point, I think law enforcement, after 20 years has realized, you can't arrest your way out of opiates. You can't arrest your way out of methamphetamine, right?
Oh, you're talking about part 2 of criminal justice reform, because we're definitely going to get into that one.
Yeah. And so, I think so. Like these kind of underlying trends, I think, have had a lot to do with how marijuana has gotten so widely accepted. There's a poll that came out, I think, a month ago from Pew Research that shows between medical and recreational marijuana support, 91% of Americans support some kind of legalization. I mean,
Yeah, that was about a month ago. I know exactly what report you're talking about.
I mean, can you think of any other issue in American society that has 91% agreement?
Kittens and puppies are cute. That's about it.
Yeah.
And I think we'd be lucky to break 90% on that one. Now, we talked about marijuana. We're going to change gears a little bit because I want to bring up something that I have read some research on this, and I've listened to a couple of interviews with people. But it's the use of psychedelics and psychotherapy, and all the reports I read had to do with PTSD. But what surprised me was the fact that every single report I read had over a 90% success rate.
Yeah, so psychedelics, we're talking about psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, MDMA.
Yes.
There's the African root, iboga, which is a very powerful psychedelic, ayahuasca, which is kind of coming into vogue. And
ayahuasca is the one I've actually researched the most out of all of them.
That's 5-MeO DMT primary psychedelic there, right? So I'll highlight one thing about psychedelic use in psychotherapy is that, number one, you don't really get necessarily the benefits that we're talking about without a therapeutic regimen, right? So
yes,
right. So you can take a psychedelic, but you have to do what's called integration therapy, right? You have to, and I work with a couple psychedelic psychotherapists here in Kansas City who are beginning to look into this field, right? So, for instance, a couple of years ago, I think the FDA approved ketamine, which is a psychedelic. It's a dissociative, right?
yes.
So FDA has now approved ketamine for I think PTSD or trauma therapy or no, refractory depression is what the approval is for.
Can we pause for 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, so ketamine, for anybody that's out there listening and my subscribers that don't know, is on one hand is considered a tranquilizer used by veterinarians, but it is also used by special operations medics in the military. So ketamine is in general use in various places. This is just an additional use that they're coming up with for it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to explain that real quick.
Yeah. So the FDA now has approved ketamine for refractory depression, right? So you can go to a physician, you can get a ketamine prescription. I've heard of injection-based therapies. I've heard of oral therapies, so like a pill or a tablet.
Yes.
Right. And then you go to a psychotherapist and you you consume the ketamine or you get the IV or whatever. Right. And after you come out of the disassociative state, you do kind of a integration talk therapy, right? Because you've had an experience where you're, the word psychedelic itself, I think, is really interesting, right? Psyche in Greek is.
Go ahead.
Yeah, psyche in Greek means mind, and delos, which is the other half of the root, is to reveal. So, psychedelic literally means mind revealing, right? So, I'm the science of psychedelics is, I'm not a scientist, but these drugs have, I think, profound capacity to, to give your brain new pathways of growth and healing, especially in trauma therapy, right? But I want to point out, another study that came out a couple of months ago. So MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, right? It was used by psychotherapists in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, I think. And then in the 80s,
actually, it was up until the 80s. And I remember when MDMA was still available in liquid form in nightclubs in the late 80s.
Yeah.
I'm actually old enough to remember that part.
So yeah, became known as a party drug in the 80s, and that's why they banned it. But
yes,
FDA recently has indicated has given it breakthrough drug status as well in the last year, and so I think it's just a matter of time before they reschedule it and make it legally available. But I think 2 months ago, a British researcher from London published a study indicating that MDMA is a breakthrough drug for alcohol use disorder, right? And so you got to think about this. In modern medicine, we still do not have a viable therapeutic regimen for alcoholism. We don't.
Well, and I will say this, because this is kind of weird, because you can withdraw from cocaine or heroin or methamphetamines, but withdrawing from alcohol in the end is physically more dangerous from the standpoint of convulsions and everything else than those other narcotics combined.
Right.
There's more people that die withdrawing from alcohol than you do withdrawing from heroin.
Oh, yeah.
So MDMA being used for that was great. And one of the studies I read was actually for PTSD, and it was a very limited study. I think it was only 6 or 8 individuals. And they did, I think it was 4 to 6 doses, depending on the individual. And they would take their dose, they would go through, they would do their talk therapy, but the success rate with it is phenomenal. It really shocked me how successful it was using that.
Yep. So, what was I saying here? So, MDMA in this British study, is now believed to be a breakthrough therapy for alcohol use disorder, and this is extraordinary, right?
It is.
But I think the underlying logic that the study is kind of elaborating is that a lot of alcoholism is fundamentally related to trauma, right? And so, which is probably one of the reasons why we don't have an effective therapy for alcoholism yet, right? Because 12-step is nice, but really all it is putting you in a community of people who are trying to do the same thing, and that's good. It's effective for some people, but it's not very effective generally, right? But if you can treat the underlying trauma issues, then people don't feel the need to self-medicate with alcohol, right? And so I think that's the underlying logic of why MDMA and other psychedelics, psilocybin or LSD, have such great potential for reducing severe alcoholism.
Well, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think if we don't address the baseline issue that led to, and it's not just alcohol, but it's any narcotics use, generally there's a baseline issue that led to people self-medicating. And if that does, and we don't do a good job of addressing that. And as men, it's not accepted sometimes that they actually attempt to address that baseline issue.
Yep. So, and then you have, there's a lot of, Oregon last year legalized psilocybin for therapeutic uses, right? So now they're implementing this law that will allow people to grow and access legal psilocybin mushrooms, which are also recognized. Psilocybin is now recognized also by the FDA as a breakthrough PTSD therapy. So I'm pretty hopeful for rescheduling, and I'm pretty hopeful for further action at the state level. So in Washington State, there is a lawsuit actually against the DEA, because the federal right to try statute, which Trump signed, actually does not have an exclusion for Schedule I drugs. So the way the statute reads is that you should be able to use a Schedule I unapproved drug, which the definition of Schedule I is has no accepted medical use or utility and high potential for abuse, right? Which, first off, I think we're now in a point in society where we realize that many of the drugs that we've put in Schedule I are miscategorized. Like marijuana is the obvious example.
That's the example I was going to use. That marijuana is on the scam schedule as heroin or methamphetamines.
Right. And think about cocaine. Cocaine is actually Schedule II, right? Yeah. It's approved as a topical anesthetic, especially in eye surgeries, right? But to think that marijuana federally right now has a status of, is not approved for anything is unbelievable, right? But to go back to my point, all these Schedule 1 psychedelic medications, I think we're at a point where, the conversation has opened up significantly at the FDA level in terms of rescheduling. So I'm very hopeful to see that happen.
Well, I would agree with you on that because all the studies I've read, I mean, about 3/4 of them are what you gave me when I was still at the lieutenant governor's office, but other ones I've looked up since then, like the MDMA study with veterans dealing with PTSD. I do think that's the future, but let's do this. Let's go ahead and cut this off here. And ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for part 2 because we're going to talk about criminal justice reform, which is where we'll get more into we'll actually address some of the issues that lead people to prison. But subscribe, let me know in the comments what you think. If you dislike, go ahead and hit dislike. Subscribe. You can hate watch and tell me in the comments or in my DMs what you think. But on the other hand, if you're going to talk about my guest, Eapen, be nice, be civil. And with that, Eapen, hopefully you'll stick around and we'll do the criminal justice reform video.
Sounds good. Thank you, Bill.
All right, everybody have a good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back with Eapen Thamby to talk about criminal justice reform. But before we get started, please subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think about what we're doing here. If you disagree, please go ahead and subscribe and hate watch. And let me know in the comments and in my DMs what you think about what I'm doing. Go ahead and decide what political faction I'm a part of because I'm very confused and you'll let me know. With that, Eapen, please introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot, Bill. I'm a longtime advocate and lobbyist in criminal justice and drug policy. Over the last 20 years, I've worked extensively on civil asset forfeiture, marijuana legalization, other issues in drug policy, but also in the broader criminal justice space, including, legislation that would create fewer barriers to entry based on a criminal conviction to the job market. So, I think we're at a point in society where there's a lot of awareness of some of the overly harsh consequences associated with criminal convictions, and at least with some criminal convictions, I would say. And I think a broader awareness that we have to deal with some of these issues now. In the state of Missouri, I think our biggest long-term issue is probably workforce development. We have plenty of jobs, but we don't have enough people who have the skills and abilities to take or hold those jobs. And I think part of the awareness, I think that is coming to the corporate world is, we should be creating more pathways to, employment, career, and education, and take down some of the barriers that we've erected over the last generation or so. So, very exciting time, obviously. But yeah.
Okay, well, and because some of this stuff but there's a huge part that we've never really talked about when it comes to me personally, is I spent quite a bit of time in juvenile corrections facilities before I joined the Army. And I had my chance to go in the Army and I kind of changed my life direction. But then after leaving the Army, I've worked as a corrections officer and a sergeant in the prison in Fulton, Missouri. I've also worked in workforce development in the veterans program where we dealt with low income, homeless, and formerly incarcerated veterans. And between the two of those, the biggest thing I found was and we talked about this when it came to when we did our first video talking about marijuana and psychedelics is dealing with the underlying trauma or the underlying issues that led them to criminality. And my experience is a little bit different from yours because you've been working on this for years.
Yeah.
I was a juvenile delinquent and then joined the Army and came into it as a 40-some-odd-year-old guy who realized that, yeah, this is a passion for me because I want to help these guys and girls. But there's very few programs around that actually address the underlying issues that led them to where they are.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. There's a lot of trauma issues that underpin, certain individuals, entering into a life of crime or into, bad life decisions generally. And I think that's something that we haven't really grasped fully as a society yet, right? I think with the emergence of marijuana and psychedelic therapies into kind of the mainstream discourse, we're beginning to talk about these things. But just from a perspective of, if you're someone who's had trauma as a child or as an adult, right, and that has an effect on how you're able to think and your mental well-being or your physical well-being. You may be in a position where you're making bad choices, right, and kind of simultaneously with that, I think we, in the last generation or so, we've really had an overgrowth of criminalization, right? So, I'm someone who advocates for that you shouldn't be, brought into the criminal justice system, for mere possession or use of a drug, right? I like the Portuguese approach where, drug possession and drug use is decriminalized, right? But on a broader basis, I think that especially on the federal level, you have a lot of harsh penalties for a lot of things that are really beginning to be examined, right? I
Yes.
gotta right. So I think we have issues here on both sides. I think that there's underlying trauma issues in the broader population that we don't fully understand and haven't really ever addressed, and that's something that leads individuals to make bad decisions that may get them into contact with the criminal justice system. And I also think that the collateral consequences and penalties that we have seen in criminal law over the last generation have been largely speaking too harsh. I think a great example is, we eliminated the prior and persistent offender statute in Missouri, right, recently, right? So
Yes.
that was the 3 strikes and you're out law, right? And actually, this past week, Governor Parson commuted the sentence of a marijuana offender who was like spending 23 years in a Missouri prison as a prior or persistent offender, right? And the law has changed, but there's still a handful of people in prison, who were convicted under that statute, 10 years or so ago, right? So I think we've seen some very positive changes from the legislature in terms of reforming some of these laws. And I think that we have a governor that really has a good understanding of why his constitutional clemency power is a valuable and a significant and a much needed, tool in this process. I'm glad to see that we're kind of seeing a reemergence of the use of executive clemency more generally, especially in, not just this state, but other states. And, hopefully this administration in the White House also considers clemency as a tool for reducing the federal prison population.
Well, yeah, and you and I kind of talked about, because I gave my opinion of the current president and vice president. But if we narrow in on Missouri, I know Representative Nick Schroyer is very big on criminal justice reform, and
Yeah.
I'm hoping to get him on to talk about some of the stuff he's done. And I found out today that Representative Sherry Tolson Reich has actually put forward a new bill to look at some of these people that were convicted for basically, in my mind, very minor marijuana violations.
Mm-hmm.
But they've served in excess of 10 years. And I mean, I think these are moves in a good direction, because I think it's time to start recognizing that we've let these, okay, if you want to call them convicts, you want to call them offenders, you want to call them inmates down. I will tell you, as somebody who has worked in a segregation house, that's actually the only human contact they may have is getting their meal or when you do your security checks. And as a human being, you stop, you listen to them for 5 minutes while they say what they have to say, because you're the only contact they have.
Yeah.
That you learn so much about what led them to where they are now. Because you take, and I have a couple of examples, and I won't give their real names, but I'll use, there was a guy in Fulton at Fulton Reception Diagnostic. His nickname was Joker. And he just looked at me one day, because we had had enough interactions at that point, and he knew I wasn't out to get him. I knew he was a human being and I'm going to treat him that way. And I'm just tired. I'm tired. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to live this criminal life. But here's what I'm going home to when I get out of prison. And we as a population had done nothing, or we as a upstanding law-abiding citizens had done nothing to prepare him to get out and get a law-abiding job and to make a living and support his family.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of things I'd like to see changed about the actual process and, policies regarding incarceration itself. Federally, I was very encouraged to see the First Step Act allowing for greater access to educational opportunities and vocational training, and to the kind of things that, I think the First Step Act actually removed the prohibition on federal education grants, right?
Yes, it did. It did actually. They have access to Pell Grants now, which is a huge thing.
Right. You go to federal prison, you can do a correspondence course, but, if you're indigent and you don't have $2,000 to send to, correspondence college to do that course, you're out of luck, right? And you're stuck with the resources immediately available to you in that facility, right? So, I think there's some very positive things happening, with the implementation of the First Step Act. And, I think especially here in Missouri, I think we have a broader awareness of we've got to create the opportunity for people to better themselves, right? And some people are going to take that opportunity, some are not. But, the ones that are, we ought to help. Glad you mentioned Representative Tolson Reich. She I've worked with her on a bill over the last few years to remove the prohibition in Missouri statute. So, like, if you're a felon in Missouri, you can't sell a lottery ticket and you can't serve a glass of alcohol, right?
Yes.
Right? So Cherie had the bill to remove that and that prohibition, right? So think about all those jobs in convenience stores where you can do whatever you want, but you can't sell a lottery ticket, right? So that prohibition removes a lot of felons from the employment pool for those, for a large part of our retail sector, right? Or I have a background in wine and restaurant and hospitality, right? Under the prohibition of felon can't serve a glass of alcohol, well, you can, as a felon, you can go to the bar and drink as much as you want, as long as you pay for it, obviously, right? But you can't.
Yes.
But you can't go to that bar and get a job and bust a table with a glass of that has that used to have a wine in it or
and see, beer. I didn't even know that part.
Right. So hospitality and restaurant is employment. Restaurants in Missouri employ 300,000 people, right? And right now is a good example of, like, every single restaurateur in the state needs help because for a variety of factors, there's just, as we are reopening and people are coming back out, there's a tremendous demand for hospitality sector, services, right? But we don't have enough employees right now.
Well, no, right? And I couldn't imagine Kansas City. I know going around Columbia, I can't go from one place to another without seeing at least one help wanted sign somewhere.
Yeah. It's a great time to be looking for a job.
Yeah.
And I got a friend here in Kansas City, Anton Kotar. He has a steakhouse at 16th and Main called Anton's. It's my favorite steakhouse in the city. But he also employs more felons than anyone else, I think, in Kansas City. And part of his rationale is that, there's a lot of people who come and show up and maybe fill out a job application, but they don't really want to work, right? They just want to stand around and work as little as possible. But the felon, who comes up for employment, they want to be there, right? Because they don't want to get in trouble. They want to be able to take care of their family. They want to, move their lives forward, right? Felon has an understanding of why they want to be there, right? So he finds that, the felons he hires are often much more motivated than, kid, in a sophomore year of college who's looking for some easy money during the summer,
Yeah. Well, and I will say this as somebody who was a corrections officer, a sergeant, and I mean, I went all out when I was in corrections. I was on the corrections emergency response team, which is a SWAT team for the inside of the prison. I was a firearms instructor. I was a defensive tactics instructor. Here's what I took away from it. Working in segregation was how many times either me or one of my officers was able to talk somebody down when we didn't have to use force, when we were able to use other tactics to get somebody to calm down and listen to what they said. And because many of these people, and there's one in particular, and I'm not going to say his name, and he didn't have a nickname. He was a just below the elbow amputee on one arm. He had assaulted an officer while I was on shift one night. His whole issue was his whole life had been, I got in trouble at 17. I got in trouble again at 19. I went to prison. I got out in my 20s. I had no future. I had nothing. I went back to prison. At this point, he's about the same age as me, but his entire life had been, I'm incarcerated because I have no skills. Nobody will hire me. And when I actually sat down and talked to him, his whole issue was he felt the light in his room, because it had to be turned on, because at that point he was on suicide watch, was cooking him from the inside out, which is psychosis. That's not being a criminal. You have actual mental issues, and you need psychotherapy to get you to a point where you can function as an adult member of society. And we were able to figure that out based on, I won't say all corrections officers will do that. I will not say that. I will say I had a good group of officers that worked with me, and I had the right mindset to actually listen to them when they had an issue. But where was the support? Where was the, okay, here's the job skills training. Here's the mental health intervention that you actually need. Because even in Fulton, so you had Kramer Diagnostic Center in Fulton. It's been closed down. Psychiatric beds, I mean, okay, so my subscribers, please fact check me on this, but I think at one point in the 50s, we had one bed for every 500 of the population. The last stats I saw were we have one bed for every 5,000 at this point. Because we've cut money to psychiatric care because it's more expensive than incarceration. So what do you have to say about that?
I got a lot to say about that. I absolutely think we need, more social service and medical service care available to those incarcerated. I absolutely think that's true. Another thing I think, and maybe this is something that we can talk at length about, is I absolutely think we should raise the social status of law enforcement, right? And I think we should pay law enforcement and correctional officers more. I think we should demand more in terms of law enforcement and correctional officer training and education. But I'd probably also highlight the most significant shift I think I've seen in my lifetime in from drug policy to criminal justice outright has been within law enforcement. And I'll give you some examples. I'm friends with my former police chief in Columbia, Tom Dresser. I haven't talked to him in a couple of years, but he's a good guy. He was the SWAT commander in Columbia. Yes. And he was the deputy police chief for a long time, and then he resigned, I want to say 2011 or 12, right? And so after he resigned, he sits down with me and we have lunch, and he actually tells me, I think we should actually legalize marijuana. I'm like, Tom, you've been kicking in doors for 20 years in this town. But, on the other hand, I had to respect what he was saying. It was a big deal, former deputy police chief, SWAT commander, to say, and that's a hard realization for, I don't know exactly how old he was at the time, but I imagine he was 55 or so, right? So this is a man who, is has had a career, right? He's had a 20 plus year career in law enforcement, and he's looking back and reflecting on the things he's done, right? And he can't look at himself and say, I did I did this for 20 years, and I can't say that we really made things any better, right? Because especially if you're looking at a metric of, we fought the war on drugs. Well, there's more pot out there. There's more heroin out there than when you started this 20 years ago.
Well,
right?
I will give you your opinion as somebody who most people would look at and go, appearances. Oh, he's just some white guy that's a conservative and this and that. He's a veteran. And yeah, we lost the war on drugs. We lost that while Nixon was still in office.
Yep.
We've been fighting a losing battle against that. So let's come up with a constructive way to deal with it.
Yep.
And to provide services for people who actually need it, as opposed to putting them in prison.
Yep. And right now there's a big time where, criminal justice is a hotly debated issue. There's, President Biden has made a lot of pledges on specific reforms to federal law enforcement and criminal justice policy. There's certainly some, very controversial issues like qualified immunity that this is a debate we've needed to have for a generation that are happening now. I'm glad to
No, I would agree with that.
But I want to highlight, the biggest misconception I ever had about law enforcement was that you had kind of a monolithic idea or, mindset in law enforcement, right? And once I started talking to cops, about 10 years ago, I realized this was absolutely not true, and I've probably talked to more, cops in the last 10 years about marijuana specifically than almost anyone else that I know, right? And I found that, first off, most rank and file cops, don't have an issue with it. Right. Again,
I will tell the big secret. Most rank and file cops, whether they said so or not when they applied, have partaked in marijuana at some point or another. Yeah, let's be honest.
Probably, but, I think especially now, we're looking at and I'll say this. So 10 years ago in Colombia, 11 years ago, they did a SWAT raid. Tom Dressner's team did a SWAT raid and on a marijuana dealer or suspected dealer, right? And this SWAT team goes in shooting. I'm not sure why, but they put it on camera, or they had it on a trading video, and the Columbia Tribune got it, and then it was on YouTube, and then suddenly the police department is getting threats from South Africa because they killed some dogs over some pot, right?
Yeah.
And so this sparked very vigorous debate in Colombia, which is a very marijuana friendly town, right? And when I sat down with Tom a couple of years later, he was like, and this is also echoed by the chief of police back in Colombia as well, who is an open advocate of saying, hey, we should get law enforcement out of the marijuana enforcement business, right? I think the fundamental issue we have with law enforcement right now in the United States is simply that we have law enforcement doing too many things that are not effective and they don't need to be doing, right? And that has corrosive effects both on the rule of law, right, and on the relationship between the government and the governed, right? We have a system where everything depends on the consent of the governed, right?
Yes.
And right, and this realization, really propelled me into the advocacy path, right? Which is you have a lot of things that need a change, right? But it's not productive to stand out on the street, I think, and demonize law enforcement, right? You have to look at the systemic issues, right? And I'll give you an example of then Senator, now Attorney General Eric Schmidt here in Missouri, right? He was a state senator for St. Louis area during the time period where the Ferguson protests were happening, right? And
and I will tell you now, when you bring up Ferguson, it's actually hits me near and dear because I was actually still in the military when Ferguson happened.
Yep.
But one of my former soldiers was actually a state trooper
Mm-hmm.
in O'Fallon.
Mm-hmm.
So he was actually involved with that.
Yeah, and actually, this isn't something I talk about often, but I was actually in Ferguson, 3 blocks from the police station, at a friend's apartment the night that Michael Brown.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was actually right. We were supposed to go down to the city for to see some music, right? And around 7 o'clock, I'm on Facebook, and I'm like, the Post-Dispatch says there's a sniper squad overlooking a prayer vigil for this kid who got killed here in Ferguson. And my friend's like, that is like a quarter-mile away, right? So we walked down to Canfield Green Apartments, and I've never saw so many law enforcement out in a place as that time, right? And I got a lot of thoughts, which probably might be a different. And I could talk, at great length about what I thought happened, which is I don't think the narrative that is put out in the media or in public, but it was certainly an absolute disconnect between executive leadership and the directives of law enforcement. I think there is an absolute disconnect between law enforcement and that community, right? And those are both
I would agree with
significant issues, right? And I can say those things without saying the cops are horrible people, right? I think there's certainly some bad apples, but the vast majority of law enforcement I've ever met or dealt with are good, idealistic people, right? And to go back to Eric Schmidt, Eric Schmidt, as one of the responses to that, and this is, and I'll never forget, hearing him talk about it. But what did he do? He introduced that bill to end taxation by citation, right? And to reduce the amount of municipal revenue that St. Louis County cities took in from fines and fees, right? And that was a very good, very positive, fundamentally correct approach, right? Because the issue that had corroded trust between the community, not just the Black communities in North County, but generally in the St. Louis, region, was that all these municipalities were using fines and fees and municipal infraction tickets as a way to raise revenue. So they were creating unnecessary interactions between law enforcement and citizens. They were using citizens as ATMs, and it wasn't something that I think you could have solved by doing anything less than a systemic change of we can't allow cities to use municipal infractions or the criminal code as a way to raise revenue, right?
You actually made me think about something that I haven't thought about before. So if you use municipal authorities, the police, to raise funds for your municipality, and St. Charles is looking at it one way, because that's a whole different economic environment than Ferguson.
Yep.
You stop me for speeding, I'm going to pull over. Yes, officer, I was probably speeding, because I do speed a lot, let's be honest. In fact, that's generally my answer when they say, do you know what you did? I was speeding. But St. Charles and Ferguson, which are both in St. Louis County, are two different economical environments from the standpoint of policing that way. Right. Ferguson is far farther down on the food scale than St. Charles could ever have nightmares about becoming. So that makes complete sense.
Right. So you had, this kind of systemic process of fines and fees and municipal enforcement that was really destroying the relationships between the community and the government, right? And so Eric Schmidt was absolutely correct to identify this first off and say, hey, there is something that we can do as a systemic solution. Now, that's not the only thing that obviously I think needs to happen in St. Louis. St. Louis is its own, nest of worms. It's one of the most, in my mind, it's one of the most corrupt cities in the nation, or areas in the nation.
I would agree with you on that. And I think they almost sabotage themselves more often than not.
Yeah, right. Now I live in Kansas City, and I could not imagine a more different place. St. Louis and Kansas City, both very liberal places in Missouri, but Kansas City just has an entirely different mentality.
I will say this as somebody who has dealt with people from St. Louis and from Kansas City. in the lieutenant governor's office. In Kansas City, there was a unifying force. And I can use the Veterans Community Project, where what was next to your name when you ran for election, whether it was D or an R or an I, nobody cared about. They came together and supported them. They came together in a meeting I sat in with the lieutenant governor about the new airport in Kansas City that they felt they needed. Kansas City does a really great job of unifying and thinking about the citizens of the city and the county as opposed to political sides.
Yep. I'll never forget the press conference where Senator Roy Blunt stands up with Jason Kander, who he just beat in an election, and talks about how to support the Veterans Community Project. That was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, Kansas City is, what is their favorite quote? The world's biggest small town.
Sly James, our former mayor, used to say, St. Louis is the westernmost eastern city, and Kansas City is the easternmost western city. And I find that to be very true.
Yeah, I like Kansas City. I can honestly say the entire time I worked in the lieutenant governor's office, I've always enjoyed any time I spent in Kansas City, because what I saw was political leadership that 99% of the time cared about their citizens.
Yep.
They would overcome that R or that D to do the best they could for their citizens.
Yep. We had Sly James, who did 2 terms, and then Quentin Lucas, obviously, just is their new mayor. But, we have political leadership in Kansas City. Sly James is probably the most visible politician in Western Missouri, right? He was always out. He was always going out.
He was. He really was.
And Quentin is the same model, right? I mean, he is always going out, and he's always accessible. He gives his phone number out on Facebook. Call or text anytime.
What I will say is, though, there is one person I want to point out, and that's Frank White. Because every time we wanted to have an event with the lieutenant governor, who was a Republican and a very considered by most to be extremely conservative, he's now the governor. Frank White was all about being a part of it.
Yeah.
And just to me, an all-around nice guy.
Well, I haven't had that much interaction with Frank, but he's not a bad guy. I think the biggest controversy in Jackson County over the last couple of years has been property tax assessments, which has skyrocketed a couple of years ago and, hit a lot of people with way higher property tax bills than they were anticipating. And, that was kind of a big kerfuffle here. But, and we have some problems in Jackson County and Kansas City generally, but I don't think we have the problems to the depth or the extent of Kansas City. St. Louis, sorry.
Yeah, I was about to say, you guys are on a whole different level in Kansas City. Let's face it. It's Jackson County and Kansas City is, I really think overall the political leadership in Kansas City and Jackson County care about the citizens of that community.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've got a big state. We've got a big state. We got 114 counties.
It's a very diverse state. If you look at what St. Louis and St. Louis County wants, what Kansas City and Jackson County wants, to be honest, what Columbia and what Boone County wants, and then you have the rest of the state.
Yeah, you can win a statewide election
in many ways.
Yeah, you can win a statewide election by winning 8 counties,
Yeah.
We've certainly got, Roy Blunt has always been probably the most connected lawmaker in the state. He's probably traversed every county 3 or 4 times, which is unbelievable.
I'm gonna ask you a question. We're gonna end on this because I really want your opinion of this. Because this has become a debate in my personal life with some of the friends I have. Roy Blunt has decided to retire. Who do you see as a Republican to replace Roy Blunt? And that is how we're going to end this. And that has nothing to do with criminal justice reform, and I'm putting you on point.
Well, I think you could have a good conversation about it from a criminal justice standpoint, right? But yeah, that is a very loaded question. I mean, the big question I think that is everyone's asking
I will tell you now, Greitens has announced, there's a few people that have announced, Sandra McDowell has not announced, and the current governor has not announced.
Right.
But the current lieutenant governor has announced he's running for governor. So
yeah. So our Senate race. Well, I like Eric Schmidt. I think he's been a tremendous, advocate for the citizens of Missouri. I think he's been a fantastic and unique presence from a law enforcement perspective. When he was a senator, he pushed forward Missouri's first cannabis reform, which was the CBD bill in 2014, if you recall that.
I did.
Right. Eric Greitens, just from a criminal justice standpoint in the governor's office was very good. He did some clemencies. He was very good about looking at ways to decrease the barriers to employment, especially for those who have a criminal record. We're still waiting to see if Jason Smith from Southeast Missouri, or Ann Wagner from St. Louis, or Vicky Hartzler from Columbia, District 4 is going to jump into this. I think the big question is, the more folks in that primary on the Republican side, I mean, does that make it more likely Eric Greitens wins? And if Eric Greitens does win, do we have a situation where a lot of moderate or independent votes go to the Democrat? I think those are big unanswered questions, right?
No, you're actually feeding into something I talk about a lot, which is you can have whatever you want behind your name, be it a D or an I or or a D or an R or an I. It's your personality.
Yeah. You got Scott Sifton on the Democrat side. He's the only really establishment figure in the race right now. But I mean, the fact is, in my mind, besides outside of St. Louis, no one knows who Scott Sifton is. He doesn't have that great name recognition. You got that veteran Lucas Clemency or Kuntz. I'm not sure how you just say
Kuntz.
Yep. He seems to have some good ideas. And he's raising money at a pretty significant clip. I just think it's an open question. I don't think the Democrats have been competitive in outstate Missouri for 10 years, or at least, Claire McCaskill was never supposed to win that, Senate race in 2012, right?
Well, what I would say about Claire McCaskill, and this goes out there to the veterans, Claire McCaskill was actually a huge proponent for veterans, and her staff was very big on doing investigations or supporting veterans.
Yeah, and I gotta say one thing about Claire: she was a fantastic campaigner. She was. I don't think she went to every county in the state necessarily, but she made it out to a lot of outstate Missouri that you don't see Democrats in. You just don't, right? So I think August is a long way away. Bill.
No, I think you're right, but I wanted to put you on point because I thought of it all of a second. So, all right, with that, ladies and gentlemen,
I think ultimately.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think ultimately the Republican primary probably comes down to Eric Schmidt and Eric Greitens. That's going to be a tough choice for a lot of the grassroots. We'll see how they feel.
Okay, so here's where we're at. So if it does it, so you're saying Eric Schmidt and Eric Greitens?
I think that the Republican primary is going to come down to. I don't see anyone else who really has the ability to get out a statewide name ID and grassroots support. I just don't. At least not without a Trump endorsement.
Okay. I'm going to go with that. And what I will say is if Eapen's wrong, he owes me a steak dinner. If he's right, I owe him a steak dinner in Kansas City. Ladies and gentlemen, have a good evening. Please like, subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you dislike what we have to say, go ahead and subscribe and hate watch because I love you too, regardless of what you say in the comments.